One angler showed up with a bucket full of premium boilies. Another simply opened a can of ordinary beans from the grocery store. A few hours later, the difference was impossible to ignore. The angler using expensive bait was still waiting for a bite, while the one fishing with fermented beans was landing fish one after another. Even more surprising, this wasn't a one-time coincidence. The same pattern kept repeating itself on lakes, rivers, and ponds. So how can such a simple bait outperform products that cost many times more? If I hadn't witnessed results like this myself, I probably would have been skeptical too. It's easy to write off one successful trip as luck because fishing is unpredictable by nature. But when the same outcome happens again and again under different conditions, you start realizing there's something more behind it than chance. Over the course of several months, anglers tested fermented beans on all kinds of waters. Some fished rivers with current, others targeted quiet lakes. Some went out at night, while others fished during the day. Weather changed, seasons changed, and locations changed, yet the results stayed surprisingly consistent. Again and again, fermented beans attracted more bites than many of the expensive boilies sold in tackle shops. That naturally raises an important question. How can a simple grocery store ingredient outperform baits created through years of product development and marketing? The answer begins with history. Fermented grains aren't a new discovery or another social media trend. Long before flavored boilies became common, anglers were already using naturally fermented baits with excellent success. Years ago, fishing was more than just recreation for many families. It was a way to put food on the table. People regularly caught carp, freshwater drum, buffalo fish, catfish, and many other species using homemade baits because modern boilies simply didn't exist. Those traditional methods were built on observation, experience, and an understanding of fish behavior, which is exactly why many of them still work today. Years ago, fishing gear was incredibly simple. Most anglers carried nothing more than a basic rod, a spool of line, and a few hooks. Their bait came from everyday foods that were easy to find: corn, wheat, barley, peas, and beans. But there was one important practice that many modern fishermen rarely think about anymore. Rather than fishing with fresh grains, experienced anglers often allowed them to ferment first. They understood that fish weren't attracted only to the bait itself but also to the natural scent created during fermentation. Peas might sit in water under the sun for several days, while beans or wheat were left in containers until the first signs of bubbling appeared. What makes this especially interesting is that fermented baits continued producing fish even on waters with heavy fishing pressure. Old fishing journals from the 1970s describe days when fermented peas consistently caught carp and freshwater drum while traditional dough baits failed completely. On large rivers, anglers relied on fermented grains and oilseed meal, while in other regions fermented corn became a trusted favorite. Back then, nobody treated these methods like secret tricks. They were simply practical techniques that delivered results. There were no catchy product names, expensive advertising campaigns, or promises of miracle catches. It was everyday fishing knowledge passed from one angler to another. Over time, however, these traditional methods gradually faded from the spotlight, and the reason behind that is more surprising than most people realize. Over time, things started to change. By the 1980s, the fishing industry was expanding rapidly. Tackle shops that once offered only basic gear suddenly filled their shelves with flavored boilies, dips, liquid attractants, and countless new additives. As the market grew, anglers began hearing the same idea over and over again. The message was simple: if you wanted to catch big carp, you needed expensive bait and the latest products. Meanwhile, traditional techniques quietly disappeared from the conversation. Not because they had stopped catching fish, but because they were mentioned less and less. Eventually, many anglers forgot about fermented baits entirely, even though they continued to produce excellent results. So why did such an effective method almost vanish? The answer starts with understanding the fish. Despite what many people think, carp don't eat everything they come across. They have a highly developed feeding system. Thousands of sensory receptors around their mouths and barbels allow them to detect tiny traces of dissolved compounds in the water, helping them locate food from impressive distances. Scientific studies carried out years ago uncovered something important. Carp react especially well to certain amino acids. Those same compounds are naturally released during the fermentation process. In other words, properly fermented grains produce exactly the kind of chemical signals that carp are designed to recognize while searching for food. There's another key factor that many anglers don't pay enough attention to: water temperature. Fermentation works best when the water is around 64 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 to 22 degrees Celsius. During this stage, the grains release natural compounds that signal an easy meal to nearby carp. Once the fish detect those scents, they often begin tracking them directly to the bait. This creates an interesting contrast with many modern boilies. Most commercial baits are designed to remain stable for months on store shelves without changing. To achieve that, they're made to resist fermentation, the very process that can naturally increase a bait's attractiveness underwater. It's an ironic trade-off that many anglers never consider. There are also a few common myths worth clearing up. One of the biggest is the belief that the stronger a bait smells, the more fish it will catch. In reality, carp aren't simply looking for the strongest odor. They respond to specific chemical compounds, which is why a naturally fermented bait can sometimes outperform an expensive boilie loaded with artificial flavors. Another popular myth is that bright colors always attract larger carp. Years of experience suggest otherwise. In clear water, especially on heavily fished lakes, older carp become extremely cautious. Anything that looks unnatural can make them suspicious. In many cases, a plain, natural-looking bait is exactly what convinces them to feed. Big carp have seen countless rigs throughout their lives, which makes them incredibly wary. They can inhale a bait, inspect it in a fraction of a second, and spit it back out before the angler even realizes what happened. That's one reason some fishermen consistently land trophy carp while others hear only the occasional beep from their bite alarm. There's another misconception that often gets in the way. Many anglers assume that a more expensive bait must automatically be more effective. But carp don't judge bait by its price tag or the logo on the package. They respond only to the natural signals they detect in the water. Because of that, simple fermented beans or peas can sometimes outperform premium commercial baits. The question then becomes, if they're so effective, what's the best way to fish with them? The approach is actually very straightforward. I always start by finding areas where carp naturally search for food. Drop-offs, transitions from soft silt to firm bottom, reed edges, or places where organic debris collects. These natural feeding zones consistently give fermented bait the best chance to produce results. You don't need a complicated rig to fish with fermented grains. A small, sharp hook, a 5, 6-inch, 12 to 15 centimeters, hook link, and a compact presentation usually produce the most natural results. In many situations, 2 beans on a hair rig are more than enough. It's a small detail, but one that many anglers ignore. Overfeeding is another mistake. A lot of fishermen assume that the more bait they throw out, the faster carp will arrive. In reality, heavy baiting often works against you. A light scattering of fermented grains is usually far more effective because it keeps fish searching instead of filling them up or making them suspicious. After years on the water, I've learned that successful fishing isn't about secret formulas or expensive additives. It's about understanding how carp behave and how conditions affect them. Long before commercial baits existed, anglers consistently caught carp by paying attention to water temperature, wind direction, oxygen levels, and natural feeding activity. Those fundamentals still apply today. Modern anglers have more choices than ever before, but sometimes the simplest methods remain the most effective. While many people chase the latest products, traditional techniques continue catching fish for one simple reason: carp respond to natural signals, not marketing. And there's one more important factor that most anglers rarely hear about. There's one mistake that can completely ruin an otherwise great fishing trip, and it's one that almost every beginner makes. If you get this part wrong, a bait that's supposed to attract carp can end up doing the exact opposite. This is where many anglers give up too quickly. They try fermented beans or peas once, don't get the results they expected, and assume the method doesn't work. But most of the time, the problem isn't the bait, it's the timing. Fermented grains have a relatively short period when they're at their best. Use them before fermentation is complete, and they won't release enough attractive compounds. Wait too long, and the bait begins losing its effectiveness. Sometimes the difference between an excellent bait and a poor one is only a couple of days. The reason is simple. As soon as the grains are submerged in water, naturally occurring microorganisms begin fermenting the sugars inside them. At around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. The process speeds up, producing a mild sour aroma similar to yogurt or whey. That natural scent spreads efficiently through the water, creating exactly the kind of signal that carp can detect from surprisingly long distances. The really interesting part begins a few days later. By about the third day, fermentation reaches a new stage. The proteins inside the grains start breaking down into simpler compounds, releasing free amino acids, the exact substances carp can detect even in tiny concentrations. This is the prime stage that experienced anglers aim for when preparing fermented bait. To a carp, these amino acids act like a natural feeding signal. Once enough of them are present in the water, the fish begin actively searching for the source. This isn't just an old fishing story. Research has shown that carp are highly sensitive to these compounds. However, there's one mistake that catches many anglers off guard. If fermentation continues for too long, the bait begins to deteriorate. The acidity keeps increasing, the pleasant sour aroma disappears, and it's replaced by a strong rotten smell. At that point, the bait starts producing compounds that can actually discourage carp from feeding. What smells like rotten eggs to us tells the fish that the area has low oxygen and decaying organic matter. That's exactly why fermentation timing matters so much. Fortunately, preparing this bait couldn't be much easier. You don't need expensive products or complicated ingredients. Ordinary beans, peas, or chickpeas work extremely well, and many experienced anglers prefer inexpensive feed-grade peas because they perform just as effectively. Best of all, the entire process begins with one simple step. If you're starting with dried beans or peas, the first step is to soak them for about 10 to 12 hours. During that time, the grains absorb water and increase in size. Once they're fully soaked, rinse them and place them in a jar or plastic container. Fill it with enough water to keep the grains completely submerged. One thing to remember, don't seal the container tightly. Fermentation creates gas, and pressure needs a way to escape. After that, nature does most of the work. Within the first day, you'll usually notice small bubbles forming, which means fermentation has begun. By the second day, the water turns cloudy and develops a light sour aroma. This is the stage where patient anglers wait, while others often make the mistake of using the bait too early. Around day 3, the fermentation process reaches its peak. More bubbles rise from the bottom, some of the grains begin floating, and the aroma becomes richer while still smelling clean and naturally tangy, similar to yeast or cultured dairy products. This is when the bait enters its most productive stage. Many seasoned anglers believe the fourth day offers the best results. By then, the liquid is packed with natural compounds that carp find highly attractive. The scent is stronger than before but still fresh and natural. If you dip your hand into the liquid, the smell stays with you for several minutes, and underwater, that same scent trail can help draw carp directly to your bait. After that point, the bait can begin losing its effectiveness surprisingly quickly. Around the 5th day, it often enters the over-fermentation stage. The pleasant sour aroma becomes harsh, the acidity continues to increase, and the bait develops a bitter smell. Many anglers believe a stronger scent means better results, but carp often avoid bait that's become too acidic. It's one of the most common mistakes people make. Temperature also plays a huge role in the process. When it's colder than 54 degrees F, 12 degrees Celsius, fermentation slows down and may take close to a week. In hot weather, everything happens much faster. At temperatures above 77 degrees F, 25 degrees Celsius, the bait can reach, and pass, its peak in only 3 days. That's why it's best to keep the container in the shade during summer and somewhere with a steady temperature during cooler seasons. Another mistake is throwing away the fermentation liquid. Many beginners drain it and keep only the grains, assuming the liquid has no value. In reality, it's packed with many of the same natural compounds that attract carp. And that leftover liquid can become one of the most useful parts of the entire method. Before making your first cast, pour a small amount of the fermented liquid into your fishing area. In lakes, it slowly spreads through the water and creates a broad scent trail. In rivers, the current carries that scent downstream, allowing carp to intercept it and follow it back to the source. Many experienced anglers have relied on this simple trick for years, and sometimes it produces bites within minutes. Bait size is another detail that's often misunderstood. Many anglers assume bigger bait means bigger fish, but that's not always the case. Large carp frequently examine oversized boilies with extreme caution. They'll pick them up, test them, and quickly spit them out if something doesn't feel right. Small beans or peas, however, resemble natural food that carp encounter every day, making them much less suspicious. A simple setup is usually all that's needed. 2 beans on a hair rig, a 6-inch, 15 centimeters hook link, and a small, razor-sharp hook create a natural presentation. Because the bait is light, the carp can inhale it without feeling resistance. As the fish turns away, the hook link tightens and the hook sets almost by itself. Choosing the right location is just as important as choosing the right bait. On rivers, carp are more likely to hold in slower water than in heavy current. Look for current seams, old river channels, deeper holes, or quiet backwaters. On lakes, productive areas often include reed beds, submerged wood, and changes in bottom depth where carp naturally search for food. Water temperature is another key factor that can dramatically affect your results. Once the water warms to around 54-57 degrees F, 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, carp become much more active and begin feeding more often. Fermented baits tend to perform their best between 64 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 to 24 degrees Celsius, when the fish are at their most responsive. However, there's one important detail many anglers forget. As soon as the water drops below 50 degrees F, 10 degrees Celsius, a carp's metabolism slows significantly. The fish eat less frequently and become much more cautious. Under those conditions, piling in large amounts of bait usually backfires. A light feeding approach combined with a small, natural-looking bait is often far more productive. Weather conditions matter too. A sudden drop in barometric pressure can change how carp behave, causing them to move higher in the water column and become less interested in standard bottom presentations. Even so, fermented grains often continue producing bites because their natural scent disperses so well. That's why they can still be effective when other anglers have already given up for the day. The more time you spend learning these patterns, the clearer one thing becomes. Successful fishing isn't based on magic ingredients or secret recipes. It's about understanding how fish respond to changing conditions and presenting your bait in the most natural way possible. That's what separates experienced anglers from those who simply copy techniques without knowing why they work. This is where the story takes an even more interesting turn. On heavily fished lakes, many anglers have noticed the same thing. Fermented beans or peas often outperform the boilies that carp have been seeing for years. So why would fish ignore expensive modern baits and choose something so simple? The answer lies less in the bait itself and more in the way carp learn from past experiences. Carp have a surprisingly strong memory. Research and years of observation suggest they can associate certain baits with danger. After being caught, or even hooked, on similar rigs several times, they become much more cautious. Instead of eating confidently, they inspect the bait, test it briefly, and reject anything that doesn't seem completely natural. Most anglers only notice that the bites have stopped, but the real explanation is often hidden beneath the surface. That's why you can see carp on your fish finder, watch them rolling on top, and still spend hours without a single run. The fish haven't disappeared, they've simply become much harder to fool. This behavior is especially common on lakes close to large cities, where carps see the same presentations weekend after weekend. Many anglers use nearly identical boilies, rigs, and baiting tactics. While that may seem normal to us, carp experience those repeated signals over and over again. Eventually, they begin treating those familiar baits as something to avoid. The fascinating part is that carp don't have to recognize a hook or understand how a rig works. Just a few unpleasant encounters are enough for them to become suspicious of similar baits in the future. In some cases, that cautious behavior can last a long time. It also explains why a lake may appear empty even though the fish are still feeding in the area. Imagine a carp that sees the same round boilies with the same familiar scents every weekend. It picks one up, feels the slightest bit of resistance, and spits it out almost instantly. The whole sequence happens so quickly that the angler notices only a small twitch on the bite alarm. The fish was there, it just never got hooked. Now replace that boilie with a small fermented bean. It has a natural shape, a familiar scent, and looks just like another food item resting on the bottom. The carp takes it with much more confidence because nothing about it seems unusual. That's why hookups are often more consistent. The difference isn't magic, it's simply that the bait doesn't trigger the fish's natural caution. Of course, experience isn't the only thing that influences carp behavior. Water conditions are just as important. Many anglers assume carp spend all their time on the bottom, but their location and feeding activity constantly change with water temperature, oxygen levels, and weather conditions. It's another important piece of the puzzle that often gets overlooked. As water temperatures rise, the amount of dissolved oxygen begins to drop. It may not sound like a major change, but to carp it can completely alter their behavior. During hot weather, they often move toward areas with higher oxygen levels, such as weed lines, current seams, natural springs, or places where small creeks flow into a lake. That's why some of the most productive summer fishing spots are near reeds or any area where the water is constantly moving. Many anglers pass right by these locations, even though carp often gather there during the hottest part of the day. Under these conditions, fermented bait tends to work especially well. Once it's in the water, fermented grain releases a steady scent trail that slowly spreads through the surrounding area. Even when rain muddies the water and visibility drops, carp can still locate the bait by following that natural scent. For the fish, it's like a trail leading straight to a food source. There's another reason fermented grains often outperform many commercial baits, and it's something most anglers rarely consider. In many situations, this overlooked detail becomes the deciding factor. Now let's move from theory to practical fishing. This is where many anglers make mistakes and later blame the weather or inactive fish. One of the biggest errors is overfeeding. Many believe that adding more bait will bring carp in faster, but in reality, too much bait often produces the opposite effect. When there's too much bait on the lakebed, carp often becomes slow and selective. They spend time picking through the loose food, satisfy their appetite, and may never even reach your hook bait. A far better strategy is to feed sparingly. Tossing in a small handful of fermented grain every 30-40 minutes keeps fish returning to the area without giving them enough food to lose interest in your presentation. The type of bottom matters just as much. Many anglers choose a spot because it's easy to cast to, but never think about what lies beneath the surface. If the bottom is covered with deep silt, the bait can disappear into it and become difficult for carp to find. Whenever possible, fish over firmer bottoms such as sand, clay, or gravel. If that's not available, you can create a better feeding area by placing a small amount of fermented grain mixed with clay on the bottom, forming a compact patch that stands out. Another important detail is hook link length. A hook link that's too long gives carp extra time to inspect the bait and spit it out before the hook has a chance to catch. If it's too short, the presentation may not look natural enough. That's why many experienced carp anglers use a 5-6 inch, 12 to 15 centimeters, hook link. Just as important is the hook itself. It should be razor sharp. A simple trick used by old-school anglers was to lightly touch the hook point against the fingertip. If it catches immediately, it's ready to fish. If it slides without grabbing, it's time to sharpen it or tie on a new hook. Fishing rivers requires a slightly different strategy than fishing lakes. In moving water, the current carries the scent downstream, creating a long trail that carp can detect from far away. That's why many experienced river anglers introduce their bait a short distance upstream from the hook bait. The fish intercept the scent, follow it against the current, and eventually arrive right at the rig. There's another small detail that doesn't get much attention. Even after fermented grains settle on the bottom, they continue releasing tiny gas bubbles. To us, they seem insignificant, but to a carp they're completely natural. As carp dig through the bottom searching for food, small bubbles are released from the sediment in exactly the same way. That's one reason carp often feed more confidently over fermented bait. Everything looks and behaves naturally: the scent, the appearance of the grains, and even the tiny bubbles rising from the bottom. Together, these signals make the feeding area seem safe and familiar. However, there's another common misconception that many anglers believe. A lot of people think carp rely only on their sense of smell when searching for food. In reality, that's only part of the story, and overlooking the rest can cost you a lot of fish. There's another myth that's worth addressing. Many anglers assume carp locate food using only their sense of smell. In reality, they rely on several senses at once. Along with detecting scent, they can feel tiny water movements and even subtle pressure changes around them. That's an ability many fishermen rarely consider. Fermented grain offers more than just a strong natural aroma. As the fermentation process continues, it releases tiny gas bubbles that create slight movement in the surrounding water. While these changes are almost impossible for us to notice, carp can detect them with ease. That's why fermented bait appeals to more than one of the fish's senses at the same time. Even so, one common mistake can cancel out all of these advantages. Many anglers prepare the bait perfectly and fish in the right location, but they continue using the same rig they would use for large boilies. That's often where the problems begin. At first glance, it seems like the rig shouldn't matter. If it worked with boilies, why change it? The answer is simple. A large boilie is much heavier and requires a carp to inhale it with more force. Fermented grains are much smaller and lighter, so they need a presentation designed specifically for that type of bait. Fishing with fermented grains requires a different approach. Beans, peas, and chickpeas are much smaller and lighter than traditional boilies, so carp take them in much more gently. If your rig is too bulky, the fish feels resistance almost immediately and spits the bait back out. From the bank, all you might notice is a single beep or a slight twitch on the bite alarm, even though the carp has already picked up the bait. One of the most common mistakes is choosing a hook that's too large. Many anglers use the same hook sizes they normally fish with boilies, but oversized hooks can work against you with small fermented baits. As the carp inhales a bean or pea, the larger hook contacts the fish's mouth too quickly, making it suspicious. The outcome is predictable: missed bites and fish that never get hooked. That's why many experienced carp anglers prefer smaller hooks, usually size 8 or 10. They are lighter, less noticeable, and still provide excellent hook-setting ability once the fish turns away. Hook sharpness is just as critical as hook size. Many anglers pay attention to the dimensions of the hook but overlook its point. Yet a razor-sharp hook often makes the difference between landing a fish and losing it. If the point isn't sharp enough, a carp can spit out the bait before the hook has any chance to penetrate properly. The surprising part is that the bait itself is rarely to blame. In most cases, poor results come from using the wrong rig for fermented grains. Many anglers try beans or peas once, fail to catch fish, and quickly decide the method doesn't work. The real issue is that the carp detects resistance before the hook has a chance to do its job. An oversized hook is only one part of the problem. There's another small detail that can cost you a lot of fish even when everything else is done correctly. When a carp picks up a small grain, the right hook remains almost undetectable. The fish continues swimming, turns away naturally, the hook link tightens, and the hook sets on its own. But many anglers unknowingly make another mistake that prevents this from happening. The issue is the hair length. Many leave it as long as they would for large boilies, which positions the grain too far from the hook. That allows the carp to inhale the bait, inspect it, and spit it out before the hook ever reaches the fish's mouth. From the bank, it looks like there are no bites at all, even though carp have already visited the bait several times. That's why many experienced anglers keep the hair about 1/4 inches, 3 centimeters, long, positioning the grain close to the bend of the hook for a much more effective presentation. Another mistake many anglers make is using a sinker that's heavier than necessary. Large weights are great for long casts, so many people use them all the time. But when fishing with fermented grains, too much weight can work against you. If a carp feels strong resistance the instant it picks up the bait, it's likely to spit it out before the hook has a chance to set. In many situations, a lighter sinker produces much better results. A sinker weighing around 2½ 3 Oz 70 to 90 g is usually more than enough. It provides reliable hook setting power while keeping the presentation natural. During those first few critical moments, the carp feels much less resistance, and sometimes that tiny delay is all it takes for a successful hookup. The hook link material is another detail worth paying attention to. Many anglers prefer stiff hook links because they work well with boilies, but fermented grains often perform better on a softer, more flexible hook link. It allows the bait to move more naturally, making it appear like an ordinary food item lying on the bottom instead of part of a fishing rig. Interestingly, many old-school carp anglers never used specialized hook link materials at all. They relied on soft, supple line that blended naturally into the water, and it consistently caught fish. Sometimes the simplest setups proved to be the most effective. Let's move on to baiting strategy. Fermented grains can be used in several ways, but the simplest method is often the most effective. Throw 1 or 2 handfuls into your fishing area and let the natural scent spread through the water. This works especially well when carp are already feeding somewhere nearby. Rivers, however, call for a slightly different approach. Many experienced river anglers introduce small amounts of fermented grain a short distance upstream instead of baiting directly over the rig. The current carries the scent downstream, creating a natural trail that carp can follow until they reach the hook bait. It's an old technique that's still remarkably effective today. The season also plays a major role. In spring, when the water reaches about 54–57 degrees F, 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, carp become much more active after winter and begin searching for easy-to-digest natural food. That's one of the best times to fish with fermented grains. During the summer, oxygen levels become the key factor. Carp usually feed during the cooler hours of the day, early morning, evening, and after dark, and large fish often move into shallow water once the sun goes down. Fall brings another change in behavior. As winter approaches, carp feed much more aggressively to build up energy reserves. At this time of year, you can gradually increase the amount of bait because the fish spend more time searching for food and are generally less cautious. And that's where another important detail can have a big impact on your success. As fall arrives, carp begin feeding much more aggressively to prepare for winter. They spend more time searching for food and become less cautious than they are during the summer months. That's one reason many experienced anglers consider autumn the best season for catching trophy carp. But as the water continues to cool, their behavior changes dramatically. Once water temperatures fall below about 46–50 degrees F, 8 to 10 degrees Celsius, a carp's metabolism slows down. The fish become less active, feed less often, and require a different approach. Heavy baiting is usually a mistake at this time of year. Small, accurate presentations tend to produce better results. Many anglers continue baiting the same way they do in summer, only to wonder why the bites suddenly stop. Water clarity is another factor that shouldn't be ignored. In stained or muddy water, fermented bait often has a major advantage because carp rely much more on scent than sight. The natural acids and amino compounds released during fermentation help fish locate the bait even when visibility is extremely poor. In clear water, the situation is completely different. Carp depend much more on their vision and become far more cautious. Thick line, bulky rigs, and excessive bait stand out against the bottom and can easily scare fish away. Under these conditions, a lighter setup, subtle presentation, and minimal baiting usually deliver much better results. The more natural everything looks, the greater your chances of getting a bite. Another factor that's often overlooked is the wind. On lakes and other still waters, it can completely change where carp choose to feed. When the wind blows in the same direction for several hours, it pushes water, insects, and natural food toward the downwind bank. Over time, those areas become feeding zones, making them some of the best places to fish. That's why many experienced carp anglers deliberately choose the shoreline where the wind is blowing. Those spots often hold the greatest concentration of natural food, and carp usually aren't far behind. In many cases, selecting the right location has a much bigger impact than using expensive bait or the newest rig on the market. Bites on fermented grains also tend to look different from bites on boilies. Instead of a powerful, screaming run, you may see only a single beep or a slow, steady movement of the line. Because the bait feels familiar and natural, carp often pick it up with much more confidence. For that reason, it's usually better not to strike immediately. Giving the fish a second or two allows it to turn away, tighten the hook link, and hook itself much more securely. As old-school anglers have said for generations, don't rush, the fish will do most of the work. When you look at the complete picture, it's easy to understand why fermented grains have remained effective for so many years. There's no hidden secret or magic ingredient involved. Their success comes from combining natural scent, familiar food, and a presentation that doesn't alarm cautious carp. That's exactly why they can continue producing bites even when many modern baits fail. But that leads to another important question. If fermented grains have been catching carp for decades, why do so few anglers talk about them today? Why have techniques that were once common on lakes and rivers nearly disappeared from fishing magazines, YouTube videos, and everyday conversations? And why do you rarely hear bait companies discussing them? The answer has little to do with carp or fish biology. It has much more to do with the way the modern fishing industry operates. If you look at today's tackle market, you'll notice that most bait products are meant to be used up and replaced. Boilies, dips, liquid attractants, pellets, and other additives all need to be purchased again and again throughout the season. For serious carp anglers, those expenses can quickly add up to hundreds of dollars each year. Fermented grains are different. One inexpensive bag of feed-grade beans or peas can provide enough bait for multiple fishing trips, and a properly prepared batch can remain usable for weeks when stored correctly. It's affordable, reliable, and doesn't require constant spending. That may be one reason these traditional methods gradually faded from the spotlight, even though many experienced anglers still use them with great success. These old techniques didn't disappear because they stopped catching fish. In many cases, they still work just as well today. The real difference is that they are simple, inexpensive, and don't require anglers to keep buying new products. Carp, on the other hand, haven't changed. They still respond to the same natural cues they always have: amino acids, fermentation byproducts, and familiar food sources. Fermented grains naturally provide all of those signals. Now let's put everything into a simple step-by-step approach that works on almost any lake or river. It all starts with preparing the bait correctly. Ordinary peas, beans, or chickpeas are all excellent choices. Soak them overnight so they absorb enough water, then transfer them to a bucket or jar and cover them completely with fresh water. At about 68 degrees F, 20 degrees Celsius, fermentation usually reaches the ideal stage after several days. Once the water becomes cloudy, small bubbles appear, and the grains develop a mild sour aroma, they're ready to fish. The next step is finding the right location. On rivers, target current seams, slower water behind the main flow, and the edges of deeper holes where carp often feed. On lakes, concentrate on drop-offs, depth transitions, reed beds, and other natural feeding areas. Firm bottoms made of sand, gravel, or clay are usually the most productive, which is why experienced carp anglers often begin their search there. Let's move on to baiting. The biggest mistake is using too much. In most situations, a couple of handfuls of fermented grain are all you need to begin. Adding a small amount of the fermented liquid helps spread an even stronger scent trail through the water. After a while, you can top up the area with another small handful to keep carp interested without feeding them too heavily. The rig itself is just as important. A small, razor-sharp hook, 2 grains on a hair rig, and a hair length of about 1/4 inches, 3 centimeters, create an effective presentation. Pair that with a soft 5/6 inch, 12 to 15 centimeters, hook link and a 2½ 3 Oz, 70 to 90 G, sinker, and the bait behaves much more naturally on the bottom. One thing I've learned over the years is that consistent success never comes from a single secret trick. It's the combination of many small details that makes the difference. When each part of the setup works together, the results improve dramatically. There are also a few old-school techniques that can increase your catch rate even more. The last step is learning to be patient. Many anglers lose fish because they strike too quickly. Bites on fermented grains are often subtle. Instead of a powerful run, you may hear one short beep or see the lines slowly tightening. Rather than grabbing the rod immediately, give the carp a second or two to turn away. That short delay often results in a much more secure hookup. A few small adjustments can also improve your results. After heavy rain, when the water becomes muddy, you can increase the amount of fermented grains slightly because carp rely much more on scent than vision. In clear water, the opposite approach works better. Use less bait and keep your presentation subtle, since carp are much more likely to notice anything that looks unnatural. If small fish keep stealing your bait, switch to larger grains such as chickpeas or beans. Panfish have a harder time eating them, while carp can take them without any problem. On rivers with strong current, another useful technique is to mix the fermented grain with clay, roll it into small balls, and toss them a short distance upstream. As the balls slowly dissolve, they release a scent trail that drifts directly toward your hook bait. There's also an old trick that many experienced anglers still use. Before fermentation begins, they add a small amount of sugar or honey. Not to flavor the bait, but to give the bacteria extra fuel. This helps fermentation start more quickly. The key is moderation. Too much sugar can cause the mixture to spoil instead of ferment properly. Proper storage is just as important. Once the grains reach the ideal stage of fermentation, place the container in the refrigerator. The lower temperature slows bacterial activity and helps keep the bait in prime condition for several weeks, so you don't have to prepare a fresh batch before every fishing trip. The main lesson is straightforward. Successful fishing isn't about spending the most money, it's about understanding the fish. Carp don't know the price of your bait, and they certainly don't care about fancy packaging. They respond only to the natural signals they recognize. Sometimes the best bait you'll ever use comes from the grocery store rather than the tackle shop. Long before commercial carp baits filled store shelves, anglers consistently caught fish with simple ingredients like grains, bread, dough, and oilseed meal. Their success didn't come from expensive products. It came from paying attention to the weather, reading the water, observing fish behavior, and learning something every time they went fishing. That's why they often outperformed anglers equipped with the latest gear and attractants. Experience can't be bought or downloaded. You can watch hundreds of videos and read countless fishing articles, but the real lessons happen on the water. So don't just accept my opinion, or anyone else's. Give this method a fair try on your own lake or river and judge the results for yourself. The next time you're fishing, you may find yourself quietly baiting up with a few fermented beans or peas while the angler beside you reaches for another expensive bag of boilies. If that simple bait ends up producing more bites, you'll understand why some of the oldest fishing methods continue to stand the test of time.